Hello, everyone, once again. Welcome to episode 10 of the Bible Beyond the Basics podcast. I'm Pastor Jason. This is Bob. We welcome you once again. We thank you for listening. We've been getting a lot of comments recently about how much people have loved listening to the podcast. We're so thankful for everyone who has been taking the time out of their schedules to listen and engage in so many ways in this conversation. We're still going through the book of Genesis, and it seems like everything we encounter in the book of Genesis is at one level or another some sort of troubling text.
Oh yeah, they're all troubling. They're gut-wrenching.
It's Genesis just seems to be, if you're looking at things from a viewpoint of what's going on here ethically, so much of it just seems to be like, what is this? Why is this happening? And how are these the stories that are setting up Scripture? But once again, we're coming back to another story that I know. You know, when I first became a Christian, I started reading through the Bible. I started with the book of Genesis and tried to get as far as I could. I think I stopped somewhere in the census or something like that. But this story we're reading this morning, I always found particularly troubling. It's the story of Abraham and the sacrifice of his son, Isaac, or the intended sacrifice. And I think part of the moral complexity here is the fact that in the story, Abraham believes that God called him to go up on this mountaintop and to make this sacrifice. So, Bob, how do we know when it's the appropriate time when we're called to sacrifice one of our children? Are there guidelines in the book of discipline for that? Or?
Well, this is very typical. You come in with these questions, and I love it because that's going to be my punchline. And now I'm going to start off. Because we always sacrifice our kids.
In some way, yeah.
You know, that to me, again, how do you read this? Who is it written for? The idea that we always are sacrificing our children, ultimately that's what we have to do. We have to give them up to God, because what's a sacrifice? But before we get into the drama of this, I do want to say, hey, Jason, thank you. We had a little of a break here because you went on a vacation that did not turn out to be a vacation, and you were at Chrisland and going back and forth with kids vomiting and pipe problems,
all sorts of things going on. But
and I want to go one other thing I wanted to make public, that we shared the Bill Cole funeral, and I mentioned that he told me that we needed more plumbers in this church. Again, way back when. And I failed to mention, because I explained I come from a trade background, a paint store, paint factory I grew up in, and you did sewage treatment.
I did. For a couple of summer. It was a pretty crappy job.
Yeah, exactly. And we say that because we can take the Bible in all these esoteric and all these idealistic ways, but as you were pointing out, this is really grisly, difficult stuff.
Absolutely.
And here in Genesis 22, we have God calling to test Abraham, as if God has better things to do than to test his people all the time.
Yeah.
It's that great line. I always love it. God never gave me anything that I couldn't handle. And people respond, well, I wish God didn't have that much trust in me.
Yeah. But that's a question. I even got that recently. Someone called me and they said, does God test us? What does it mean? How do we know if God is testing us? That's something that's still very prevalent on some of our minds, at least on occasion. Yeah.
And, the reality is everything a test. And it kind of goes back to, we always sacrifice our children. It means that sacrifices, we have to give them up to God. The hardest thing was, after our 3 children, to basically realize we're home alone, Elaine and I. We've given up our children to the world, and so there is a sense to that we have to go in trust, and they're a gift, they're alone.
And I mean, even in our practice of baptism, that's a big part of what we're doing.
Yeah.
We're giving them up to God, and we're making the commitment to raise them in in Christian character and such, but we're also giving them up to the community that will be doing this in a joint effort. But we're saying this isn't about us, it's about all of us, and that eventually this child is not our own, and they're going to go off to live the life that they're going to live.
They're children of the promise. And that brings us to the gripping drama of we had a curriculum once when we did sacred art. And inspired by Rembrandt's Prodigal Son, and Nouwen's book on that. And the other one that is very gripping is Rembrandt's painting of the sacrifice of Isaac.
Absolutely.
We talk about sacrificing our children all the time, but we didn't take a knife to their throats. And you see a quiescent in this painting, illuminated, because always look for the light in Rembrandt, the dark and the light. And Isaac is illuminated. His head is back, and the knife is about to be drawn, but the angel is grabbing his wrist, and the eyes of Abraham are profound. It really dramatizes this awful event. When he's called by God to go to Mount Moriah, which, interestingly, some people will associate with the Jerusalem. The Chronicles does that. And on one level, we've talked about this a little bit earlier, how it's a polemic about child sacrifice. Because, for example, there was child sacrifice.
That's the way I've always... Well, it's the way that I've come to interpret it. This is a polemic against child sacrifice. This whole thing is occurring so that God can say no.
Right. And on one level, that is absolutely, because here from 2 Kings, and he defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, so that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Molech. It did happen, and we talked about Gehenna, and we talk about all the sacrifice. And now the peculiar thing is, if you think God is always good, then even a sacrifice of a child is going to be good. So that's part of what we're dealing with the drama of the painting by Rembrandt, and this. I mean, Abraham doesn't even tell Sarah what he's doing. He doesn't tell Isaac what he's doing.
That's part of the ethics of the situation, and in the fact that, as Christians, many of us are thinking, how can we follow God, as it were, and here's one instance in which Abraham is called by God to do something. And I think this particular passage has been misinterpreted in many ways over history, to think, well, if God can cause Abraham to do this, what other sorts of things can God call people to do? And that interpretation has caused so many problems over the years.
And as if Abraham hadn't been tested enough. But this is going on the line, because now Abraham and Sarah, he had been given the covenant, given the promise of the heirs, but at a certain point it's not happening between Sarah and Abraham, and so Sarah gives up Hagar, her slave, to produce a child, Ishmael, and Hagar is so ill-used by all of them. Ishmael is ill-used, but he's not going to be the child of the promise.
There is a wonderful section in the midst of all of that. Is Hagar is banished away, and she is out in the wilderness on her own. And there's a name that's given to God in there that is essentially the God who sees. And it's a wonderful picture of, even though Hagar and Ishmael are out there, they're on their own, they've been abandoned by the people of God, Abraham and Sarah, God still sees them. And I think that's a beautiful bit to come out of all of that horrendousness.
Yeah, and it is horrendous. This is awful stuff. As I said, so it also puts to the point to what Isaac represents. And Isaac then represents the child of the promise, the heir of the people of God, who's going to inherit what Abraham was called to become. And so this test is really putting it on the line, because he's going to have to give up the promise of God.
It's one thing to think like, oh, I might lose my child, which is a terrible, horrific thing. But it's even more so than that. It's everything that this child is associated with. This child stands as the very physical manifestation of all of God's promises to Abraham. You know, is God faithful? Well, that all rests in this one person.
Yeah, and whether you want to call it irony or just biting cynicism, when Sarah laughs at the idea that she's going to grow old and have a baby, she's old and going to have a baby, Isaac means laughter. And there's not much funny going on here with Isaac.
No, it's not a funny circumstance.
He's being taken up to the Mount Moriah, and he's kind of wondering, okay, Dad, what are we doing here? As it's described, and well, God will provide. Well, God's provided
It's
Isaac.
okay, buddy.
Which is why, by the way, and I never quite get it because Kierkegaard is way too smart for me to read, but in his Fear and Trembling, the other great work of art is how Kierkegaard deals with this story and his Fear and Trembling. The idea that he presents basically 4 scenarios, how this could have played out.
Yeah.
And then, but also then coming to the idea that the question as he raises, and again dealing with stories from different perspectives, would God really allow this? And the idea of religious obedience versus ethical morality.
Not even would God allow this, but would God call someone to this?
Yeah.
Would this be what God willed and desired?
Right. And why is Abraham going to be secretive about this? Kierkegaard describes Abraham as both admirable and appalling, which great writing, by the way, from these theologians. Can something be religiously right but ethically wrong? And so he plays with this theme. And what is partly going to the idea that if this is a test of Abraham's obedience, it's not as if he hasn't already proved it. But who do you have to prove? And as I say, I'm tired of proving my obedience, especially when I have to give up that which I love the most.
What does it take for something to be religiously right?
Yeah.
How can you determine if something is religiously right? I mean, I guess you can follow the texts and things like that, and certainly if something's written down, you do these prayers at a certain time or whatever it might be. But how can you tell if something in your personal life is the religious thing that you're meant to do?
Well, and this is why another great theologian, C.S. Lewis, talks about the Tao, the universal truths of morality. And we see how, another great theologian, Karl Barth, always said the best thing about humanity is religion, the worst thing about humanity is religion. Because Jonestown, we're not honoring, not celebrating, but recognizing and commemorating the terrible things that cults can do. The abuse of women in the name of religion. This kind of stuff in the name of religion.
Yeah.
Versus that which C.S. Lewis talks about, which is the universal truths, the virtues, and the morality, which are consistent throughout all culture.
Yeah. But even so, some of that, you look at Jonestown and you think, well, that clearly looks like something that's wrong. However, there are things that the Christian faith has had to repent from over the years that we've just gotten straight out wrong. The way we treat women, the way we treat certain people groups. There are things that we've set as a standard for the way that we're meant to act, and eventually we realize we're not getting these things right.
Yeah. And so that how far do you go? And Abraham, in this drama, is going the distance. He's, the Rembrandt painting, the knife is at his son's throat and in his hand. And he's going to do it. Now, the question that Kierkegaard asked was the real trust of Abraham to believe that God would not allow this? And that's, I think, where Kierkegaard is nudging us towards the deeper truth. The polemic is true, but the deeper truth is, would through the angel, which are, by the way, angels are flunkies. I call them divine flunkies because they're simply manifestations of the will of God. They have they're not beings. They have no will of their own. So they're simply expressing God's real desire is morality, to preserve life.
And I think that that goes along with all that you've been saying. If we want to measure what is a true religious ethic, we have to ask ourselves, does this seem morally right? Yeah. Would God really ask us to do something that is outside of the realm of what we would consider just or loving or caring? And I think that ultimately, I mean, you can have so many discussions about this, but I think ultimately the answer is no. That is one level that we can hold up, saying, like, you know, we might think this is religiously true, but we're not meant to kill people. And I think that's why I like this interpretation of this passage. God is showing us that God is moral. God is demonstrating that God does not accept child sacrifice, which was a common thing at the time. God is not like the other gods, or the interpretation of the other gods as it were in the area region.
And which promise is Abraham going to obey? Or which instruction, which call? Is it to sacrifice his son, or is he going to have the greater promise in the fact that he would be the father of the universal faith? Which is what we're going to hear down the road with Paul's great realization.
Children as the stars in the sky.
Yeah. And so, which is the greater trust of Abraham? And I think that goes into the deeper mystery and the deeper heart of it. Like all these things of these awful texts, there's layers. And we have to enter into the picture. How far would we go to trust God and the promise of hope, of life? And that's where God morally lives.
Well, have a great week. We'll see you next week. God bless.
God bless.